Hey Chestnuts, I'm Sasha and welcome to the Spanner Lab. Today we're going to be looking at a game between one of my students, Ultra of Asolus, and one of the chess club parents. It was under very short time controls, so it's not the most accurate of games because I think there was a lot of time pressure. But there's a lot of interesting things to look at here. So let's jump right in. E3 opening. The Van et Kruis opening, I hope I'm saying that correctly. This is a standard for this player, so I've made a video on the coal system that I think would suit Ultra Asolus much better, because you'll see that as we start to play, he is building up that characteristic coal system with the 3 pawns, the bishop and the knight. Okay, so now the queen's on this d2 square, but that's only because that queen came in there. If instead of queen to d2, knight to d2 have been played here, now we're looking at a setup that looks a lot more like the coal system that we're used to. So that's the situation we end up in. So it's a fairly solid opening for white. Doesn't really take the initiative, doesn't really start any attacks, doesn't really threaten anything, but it's gonna deliver the player of the white pieces to the middle game safely. So we get g5, which is a bit of an unusual one, but nothing really wrong with it, apart from the fact that it's going to mess up this king side a little bit, but it's not fatal. Castles, solid. G4 comes in, just causing havoc. H4, good. Bishop to H6. And then G3 gets played, which is not great for the castled king. Anytime you've castled kingside, you want to avoid putting a hole in your defenses. So this is your castle wall. So there's your castle tower, there's your castle wall. That's why it's called a castle. G3, what that's going to allow your opponent to do is get a bishop or a queen looking at these squares next to your king, and that's going to put you in a little bit of danger. So don't let them in. Knight to d5 gets played. If black had played that instead, the knight gets forced back. There is a play for black if the knight goes to f5. Black ends up winning by quite a lot, so just come back. And then mistake. So after knight to d5, we get this mistake. It's just a simple... I see what the motivation is for white. That bishop's going nowhere, that knight's not got a good square. Everything else, you've kind of done what you wanted to achieve with the opening, which you've got castled. You kind of hit this point where you want something to happen, and you don't know what, so you're just going to move pieces until something happens. So we end up in this sticky situation. Happens quite a lot with openings that push the d4 pawn. D-pawn openings tend to get quite sticky. You tend to get in these positions where neither player really has any attacks going. A lot of people don't like d4 for this reason, but for some people it's nice to not be attacked all of the opening. It's nice to get out the opening and just think, alright, breathe, I'm not under attack right now, this is great. So bishop to h7, bishop takes h7 happens. So losing the bishop for a pawn. If you're struggling for what to do right now, think, okay, this knight doesn't have any good squares. the only square that my knight can go to currently is here. I'd love to be here instead. I can't be here because of that c3 pawn, but I'd love to be here instead. Now what if I made that threat on h7 real? What if I could make that an actual threat rather than just something imaginary? Well, how about instead queen to c2? So now that square is available, and we've got two pieces looking at that square now. So now that is a real threat. After that, the knight has to go back to f6. So the black's no longer got this strong central knight, and now white can get that knight to d2. So white's forced black back and got his own pieces out. But instead that didn't happen, so we lose the bishop on h7 instead. Knight to a3. So famous maxim from Tarash, a knight on the rim is dim. We know that, but again, these squares are blocked off. If we just move the queen to c2, we'd have that square available. A6, so now black's out of ideas, and knight to c4. Great, good. What follows now is a few mistakes. I think we're starting to realise we might have used a bit too much time in the opening, so both players are now going to make a bunch of mistakes. That happens. White goes, okay, well now my knight's under attack, I guess I'll move it again. Better than moving an attacked piece, defend it. Defend that piece and attack that rook on h7. So that knight's safe, and now that rook has to do something. So that rook goes back, and then we get a4, which is going to attack the queen. Now, where does that queen go from here? Well, let's see if you can see where that queen goes from here. So now b3 is the only available square for that queen. Things are getting quite dangerous for that queen now. Yeah, it's just not looking good at all. So after queen to b3, I'd be worried if I was black. Like that queen is not looking good right now. But we didn't get that. We got knight to a3 instead, moving that piece out of the way. Queen to a5. Here we could just put the knight back on c4. We've been given a chance to just do the same thing again. Knight to c4. Queen should run away. D takes c5. D takes c5. Rook to d1. So building up pressure on that knight in the center there. Instead, we get b4, which is not a good move. And then we get bishop to f5, which is a worse move. So I think they were panicking. Both players starting to run out of time, starting to speed up. White rightfully takes the queen, and here is where the game turns. So up until that point, black, because of that loss of the bishop on h7, was solidly winning. From now on, Ultra Asolus is winning the whole way through. Knight takes, knight takes, knight c4, and again we get a little smattering of mistakes after this brilliant move. Brilliant. Ultra Asolus, it's brilliant. Because what it's going to do is this looks like a knight sacrifice, okay? In doing this, you've taken off that pawn, and you're going to win it back, win that knight that you've lost back. So you're 2 pawns down at this point. D takes c5. You've taken another pawn. You're only down 1 pawn, and then after knight takes f6, you get that knight back. You're now up 2 pawns, and that is where you will stay. So you've gained 2 pawns with this move. Black played the wrong move in response, and that's where we get a smattering of bad moves. Please just take this knight. Please just take it off. Rook to d8, d takes c5, d takes c5, and then rook to d1, and now that, because of that pin, that knight's not going to stay on the board for very long. You know, you have to... This is best play, this really long, wiggly knight rook move. That's best play for both sides, and white wins the knight and doesn't lose the queen, because that's what happened instead. This queen was left to be taken. Did the player of the black pieces notice? No, she did not. Bishop takes e3, unless she's doing the standard parent thing and, you know, letting the juniors get away with it. But they don't learn from that. Bishop takes e3. Not really much to be said at this point. There is just a sequence of unfortunate moves where both players ignore the hanging queen on d2. Finally she gets away. Knight to e5, queen takes e3, d5, queen takes e5 check, and king to d7, and here we get a few missed mates before the end of the game. I'm just going to show you a couple, just so you can see how you would try and finish off this. So right now, queen's in a great position. Get something else in there. Bring that bishop to f4. So now, both your queen and your bishop are lined up together. So they're lined up together. They're looking at those same squares, and that's going to be critical. f6 is the best that black can come up with at this point. And then queen to c7 check. Using her X-ray vision to target that rook on h7. So queen is now protected. So we're starting to see this kiss of death pattern. It doesn't end up being the kiss of death because the king still has 2 squares to go to, but the queen's defended, so we can make these checks safely. King goes to e8, and the queen takes. So now the king is limited to this back rank. We're just cutting squares away from that king. King to f8 is as good as it's going to get. Bishop to d6 check. Bringing the bishop closer because you can't checkmate with just a queen. King goes to e8 because that is the only square left available, because the queen is covering all of these and here. So after that check, the only square left is e8. And can you see it? Can you see checkmate? It is a kiss of death checkmate where the queen is protected. Queen to e7 checkmate. There are a few checkmates like this that were missed because the bishop wasn't brought into play. The only reason to leave your bishop on c1 is so that you can set up for the next game quicker. So black managed to get her rook out instead. Queen to f5, again missing the opportunity for bishop to f4, and then winning that rook that way, and then forcing a checkmate here. Can you see it? This is another kiss of death checkmate, where the queen is covering all of the squares that black's king can go to, but not protected by the bishop this time, protected by a different piece. So it is queen to b4 checkmate. So the queen is covering a4, b6, and b5, as well as making this check. The pawn is protecting the queen, and the only escape square that would have been available to the king has his own traitorous pawn on it. But we don't get that checkmate. So instead, you get the bishop taking the rook, and off there. And now we get the other rook being brought in. Good, we've had other pieces brought in. This is going to allow checkmate. Exchange off the pieces. Good. When you are ahead on material, in general, it's a good idea to simplify. From this position, black can technically win. They're not going to. You've got no chance of a surprise checkmate in this position. If you can get your opponent to a place where you have no surprise checkmate, you can relax a little bit. The lovely discovered check. Rook to h4, a5, queen to e4, king to g5, and here a brilliant move was played. A brilliant move was played. g4, rook sacrifice. Love it. I'm not going to dismiss Ultra Asolus here by thinking this might have been an accident. g4 is a brilliant move. Full stop. Because if king takes h4, the king's brought itself onto the edge. It's cut off 3 of its own escape squares because that's off the edge of the board. If you can bring the king to the edge of the board, that's 3 escape squares that king doesn't have. So sacrificing the knight on h4 brings the king to the edge of the board, where now the queen can take off even more squares. So the queen has taken away this square and this square, as well as continuing to protect this pawn. This pawn is attacking this square, so now the king can only go to one square. And now next move is checkmate. So it's not a kiss of death checkmate. This one, I suppose, is a back rank checkmate where the king and the pawn are defending these escape squares. So this is queen to h5 checkmate. Queen to h6 doesn't work because the king can take on g4, so it's got to be queen to h5 checkmate. But instead the king went to f6, continuing to stay as central as possible. Here white played rook to h5. Rook to h7 would have been a better move. So we're trying to cut off as many squares as possible. So rook h5 is good because we are forcing the king up this way towards the edge of the board, where we can start to do those back rank checkmates. Rook to h7 is slightly more decisive. So rook to h7 cuts off all of these squares. All of these squares are already cut off by the queen. So from here the king only has one more square it can go to, and it's checkmate on that square. So if the king moves to g5, it's checkmate. Okay, so can you see checkmate in this position? I'll give you a few seconds. It's not one of our standard checkmates. It's a bit more interesting. The rook is defending the escape squares and the queen makes check. It's queen to f5 checkmate. Even if the king refuses to go to g5 and instead plays the one other remaining move, a4, the same checkmate is available because the rook is defending both of these lines. So instead we get king moving up towards the edge of the board, queen to c6, king to g8, queen to c7, just taking away more and more squares, king to f8, and here we get the checkmate, rook to h8. So we got our rook roller checkmate. We've got one major piece controlling that rank, and then check with the other major piece. So that was the game, the win for Ultra of Asolus. I hope you enjoyed it. As ever, like and subscribe, and I will see you again next time. Bye!